1923, Hermann Hilprecht published the final volume of his translation work on tablets recovered from Nippur between 1889 and 1900. Among them was catalogue entry HS 1684, a fragment measuring 11 centimeters across, broken along its right edge but otherwise intact. The obverse contained what appeared to be a standard administrative notation: vertical columns, names aligned with numbers, the familiar wedge marks of Sumerian cuneiform pressed into clay while still wet. But the numbers themselves presented an anomaly. The first king listed, Alulim of Eridu, was assigned a reign of 28,800 years. The second, Alaljar, 36,000 years. 8 kings total before the entry, the flood swept over. Then the list resumed. Kingship descended again, this time at Kish, and the numbers changed. Still long, 1,200 years, 1,560 years, but no longer in the tens of thousands. The tablet had been fired, archived, and preserved with the same bureaucratic care given to grain receipts and temple inventories. It was treated as a record. Not as myth, not as allegory, not as sacred literature. It was filed alongside documents that tracked livestock, calculated rations, and recorded the movements of goods across administrative districts. The scribes who copied it in later periods, this fragment dates to the Ur-III period, roughly 2100 BCE, but references far older sources, did not append explanations. They did not mark it as symbolic. They copied the numbers exactly as they appeared in the texts before them. What distinguishes this tablet from others in the Nippur archive is not its content, but its context. It was stored in the temple complex's administrative wing, not in the literary archive where hymns and myths were kept. This suggests it was understood as reference material, something consulted, not recited. The scribe who produced HS 1684 worked in the same scriptorium that generated tax records and land surveys. The clay was local. The script follows standard orthographic conventions. The hand is practiced, not ornamental. This was not a special commission. It was not a royal dedication or a temple offering. It was a copy of earlier material, produced because earlier material was being copied. Other fragments surface across decades of excavation. The Weld Blundell prism, acquired by the Ashmolean Museum in 1922, contains a more complete version of the same list. Four-sided, inscribed on all faces, it records kingship from the moment it descended from heaven through the reign of Sin-Magir of Isin, roughly 1827 BCE. The scribe responsible for the prism identifies himself in a colophon, Nur Ninsubur, writing during the reign of Utu Hegel of Uruk. He states that he is copying from older sources. He does not say he is composing. He does not say he is interpreting. He says he is preserving what was written before. The prism was not discovered in a temple or a palace. It was found in a private house, likely belonging to a scholar or scribe who kept reference materials. Another version appears on Sumerian King List, manuscript WB 444, excavated from Lhasa. It matches the Weld Blundell prism closely, but diverges in small details: alternate spellings, slight numerical variations, additional rulers in certain dynastic sections. These differences are not random. They reflect different source traditions, different archives, different chains of copying. The scribes were not inventing content. They were reconciling sources that did not perfectly align. This is the behavior of archivists, not mythmakers. The question is not whether these numbers are literally accurate by modern chronological standards. The question is, what system of measure were the scribes using? In Sumerian administrative practice, time was quantified in multiple ways. The calendar divided the year into 12 months of 30 days, with intercalary months added to realign lunar and solar cycles. Longer spans were tracked using regnal years, in the 3rd year of Shulgi, when the temple was built. But the king lists do not use regnal year notation. They use raw numerical totals, accumulated sequentially. Alulim ruled 28,800 years. Then Alaljar ruled 36,000 years. Then Enmen-Luana ruled 43,200 years. The list presents these figures without conversion, without explanation, without apology. The numbers themselves follow patterns. Many are multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian Shah, a large round number in the sexagesimal counting system. Some are multiples of 1,200. A few align with the Ner, another standard unit equal to 600. These are not arbitrary figures. They are structured, systematic, and internally consistent. They behave like measurements. Whether they measured solar years, ritual cycles, genealogical generations, or something else entirely, is not specified in the text. But they were treated as measurements by the scribes who recorded them, copied them, and filed them in administrative contexts. There is no editorial commentary in any known version of the King List that suggests these numbers were understood as symbolic or exaggerated. Later Mesopotamian scribes were perfectly capable of distinguishing between literal and figurative language. Mythological texts, Enuma Elish, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Descent of Inanna, use different formulaic structures, different narrative techniques, different filing systems. They were kept in separate archives. The king lists were not stored with myths, they were stored with king lists. The scribes did not treat them as the same kind of text. This raises a procedural question. If the numbers were understood to be inaccurate or symbolic, why preserve them exactly? Scribes regularly updated administrative records. When a new king took the throne, new tablets were inscribed. When a city changed hands, the archives were reorganized. When a dynasty fell, the records were either destroyed or absorbed into the victor's archives. The king lists were copied continuously across centuries, from the early dynastic period through the Old Babylonian period, without the numbers being revised. The figures for the antediluvian kings remained stable across manuscripts. 28,800 years for Alulim, 36,000 for Alaljar, 43,200 for Enmen-Luana. The scribes preserved what they inherited. What this suggests is that the numbers were not considered errors requiring correction. They were data. They came from older sources, and those older sources were authoritative enough that later scribes did not alter them. The continuity of transmission implies a continuity of archival responsibility. The lists were understood as inheritance, records passed down from prior institutions, prior cities, prior administrators who were no longer accessible, but whose work was still trusted. The scribes of the Ur-3 period, when many of these copies were made, lived in a highly centralized bureaucratic state. They tracked grain surpluses down to the litre. They maintained multi-year account reconciliations. They knew how to count. If the numbers in the king list had been obvious fabrications, they would have been marked as such, or isolated in a different category of text. But they were not. They were preserved in the same administrative language used to track real events, real resources, real institutions. The form of the document matches the form of record-keeping. What remains unclear is what the original archive looked like, the source texts from which these later copies derive. The colophons sometimes reference old tablets, brick inscriptions, or temple records. These originals have not survived. What survives are copies made centuries or millennia after the events described. But the act of copying implies that the originals existed, that they were accessible, and that they were deemed worth preserving. The question is not whether kingship lasted 28,800 years. The question is, what did the original scribes mean when they recorded that number? And why did every generation of scribes afterward treat it as information rather than invention? Kingship in Sumer was not described as an invention. It was described as something that descended. The word used in the Sumerian King List is Nam-Lugal, composed of Nam, abstract state or condition, and Lugal, great man, king. But the verbal phrase that introduces it, Nam-Lugal Anta Ed, translates more precisely as kingship came down from heaven. The verb ed means to descend, to go down, to be lowered. It is the same verb used for rain falling, for goods being unloaded from a boat, for objects moving from a higher place to a lower one. It is not a metaphor. It is a directional term. This phrasing appears consistently across versions of the King List. It is not poetic variation. It is documentary formula. The scribe at Nippur who inscribed HS 1684 used it. The scribe who carved the Weld Blundell prism used it. The scribe at Lhasa used it. The stability of the phrase suggests it was inherited from the earliest layers of the tradition, copied forward because it was understood to describe an actual sequence. First there was no kingship, then kingship came down. Then it was held by rulers in Eridu. Eridu is archaeologically significant. Excavations conducted by Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd between 1946 and 1949 revealed continuous occupation stretching back to the Ubaid period, roughly 5300 BCE. The site contains at least 18 superimposed temple levels, each built directly atop the ruins of the previous structure. The earliest temples are small, single-room shrines with offering tables and altars. By the later Ubaid levels, the temples are larger, more complex, with multiple chambers and evidence of regular ritual activity. But the continuity is unbroken. Eridu was not resettled. It was never abandoned. It was continuously inhabited and rebuilt on the same sacred ground for millennia. The texts identify Eridu as the first city to receive kingship, not the first city to exist. Other settlements appear in the archaeological record at roughly the same time, but the first to have a king. The distinction matters. A city is a physical settlement, an aggregation of buildings and people. Kingship is a form of authority, a recognized institution, a relationship between ruler and ruled. The King List does not say that Eridu was founded. It says that kingship descended there. The city already existed. What changed was the form of governance. This is consistent with what administrative tablets from slightly later periods reveal. Early dynastic texts from Uruk, and Lagash describe governance structures that involve temples, assemblies, and officials called ensi or en, terms that refer to priest rulers or city governors but are distinct from lugal, the word for king. Some cities never had kings. They had priestly leadership, councils, or collective governance. Kingship was not universal. It was specific. It existed in certain cities at certain times, and the texts treat its arrival as an event, not a natural development. Tablet MS 3026, housed in the Shoyan collection, contains a partially preserved copy of an early dynastic administrative text from Shuruppak, one of the cities listed in the King List. It dates to approximately 2600 BCE. The text records distributions of barley and oil under the authority of an official whose title is ensi, not lugal. There is no king mentioned. The city functioned without one. But according to the King List, Shuruppak later received kingship during the antediluvian period under a ruler named Ubar-Tutu. The archaeological layers of Shuruppak show continuity of occupation, but the administrative tablets from earlier and later phases reflect different governance structures. Authority existed before kingship. Kingship was something added. The verb ed also appears in mythological contexts, but not as often as one might expect. In the Sumerian poem Inanna's Descent to the Netherworld, the goddess descends, ed, from heaven to the underworld. The verb describes physical movement between cosmological zones. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the gods descend from the heavens to establish order on earth, but the Sumerian versions of similar material are less explicit. The verb is used, but sparingly. It is more common in administrative and ritual texts, where it describes the movement of divine statues during processions, the lowering of offerings into temple foundations, or the arrival of goods from distant regions. What this linguistic distribution suggests is that Nam Lugal Antar Ed was not borrowed from mythology. It was a technical phrase, part of the formal vocabulary of record-keeping. The scribes used it the way they used other directional verbs: to bring, gub, to stand, tum, to carry, to describe transfers of authority, responsibility, or goods. Kingship was treated as something transferred, not something created. The question this raises is, transferred from where? The phrase specifies from heaven, Anta. But An, in Sumerian, does not only mean the cosmic sky or the divine realm, it also means above, high place, or upper region. In some contexts, it refers to the highland regions northeast of Mesopotamia. In others, it refers to elevated temple platforms. The word is positional, not exclusively theological. When a text says kingship came down from An, it could mean from the heavens, from the mountains, from the temple, or from an earlier, higher authority. The phrase is precise in saying kingship moved downward. It is less precise in identifying the origin point. There is no corresponding phrase in the King List that says kingship was invented, established, or created. It is always described as descending, being received, or being transferred. The city of Kish received kingship after the flood. The city of Uruk received it after Kish. The verb changes slightly, shuti, to take in hand, or nam lugal ba'antum, kingship was brought, but the semantic core remains. Kingship moves between locations. It is not generated anew in each place, it relocates. This matches the physical evidence from royal inscriptions. When a king in Mesopotamia took power, he often claimed to have restored or renewed kingship, not to have founded it. Ur-Nammu, the founder of the Ur-3 dynasty, does not say he invented kingship. He says he received it from the god Enlil, who granted it to him after the previous dynasty fell. Hammurabi of Babylon says that Marduk called him by name and entrusted him with kingship. The language is consistent. Kingship is transferred, bestowed, inherited. It is not originated by the king himself. The scribes who maintained the King List were operating within this framework. They did not present kingship as a human achievement. They presented it as something that arrived, was held for a time, and then moved elsewhere. The early dynastic cities competed for this status. Inscriptions from Lagash claim that kingship resided there under Eonatum. Inscriptions from Uruk claim it resided there under Gilgamesh. Inscriptions from Ur claim it under Messanipada. These are not conflicting myths. They are competing political claims about the same transferable institution. Each city insisted that kingship had come to them, descended, been granted, been bestowed. The institution itself was older than any one city's possession of it. What the King List preserves, then, is not the history of government, but the history of an idea. That legitimate rule came from somewhere else first, that it was received, not originated, that it moved through time and space according to patterns the scribes were attempting to document. Whether that origin point was the heavens, an earlier civilization, or an archival memory no longer accessible, is not specified. What is specified is the movement itself. Kingship was not born in Eridu, it came down to Eridu, and later it moved on. Tablet NI 3191, excavated from Nippur and now held in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum, is one of several fragmentary copies of the Sumerian King List that stop mid-sentence. The text begins in the standard formula. After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. It then lists rulers of Kish with reign lengths, moves to the first dynasty of Uruk, begins the second dynasty of Ur, and then stops. Not at the end of a dynasty, not at a natural break point. The scribe carved the name of the king, Meshki-Angasha, then began the phrase for his reign length, ruled for, and then the tablet ends. The edge is finished, smoothed, fired. This is not a break from damage. The tablet was completed as is. This is not an isolated anomaly. Manuscript G from the Oriental Institute in Chicago, catalogue number A3444, contains a nearly identical text, but stops at a different point, mid-list, after the 9th king of the first dynasty of Kish, before transitioning to the dynasty of Eanna. The scribe wrote the king's name, added the number of years, and then ceased. Again, the tablet is intact. It was finished deliberately in this incomplete state. Another fragment, WB62, held in the Ashmolean, begins not at the start of the king list, but midway through the dynasties, starting with the rulers of Awan, a city in the highlands east of Sumer. The text runs for 11 lines, listing kings and reign lengths, and then stops, without reaching any known endpoint. The reverse of the tablet is blank, smoothed, but uninscribed. The scribe did not run out of space, the scribe stopped writing. These truncated versions are not drafts. They were fired, which means they were considered finished. They were archived, which means they were considered worth keeping. They were copied from earlier sources, which means the truncation was intentional. The question is, why would a scribe deliberately produce an incomplete version of a document? One possibility is that the scribe was copying from a damaged original. If the source tablet was broken, the scribe could only copy what remained legible. But this does not explain why the new copy was fired and archived. A partial copy of a broken source would typically be noted as incomplete. Scribal colophons often include phrases like tablet damaged, text unclear, or broken, cannot read. None of the truncated King List manuscripts include such disclaimers. They are presented as complete within themselves. Another possibility is that these tablets were not intended to be comprehensive. They were excerpts copied for a specific purpose, perhaps for a student learning scribal practice, or for a ritual context where only part of the list was needed. Early dynastic and III scribal schools used excerpts from longer texts as pedagogical material, but student copies are usually marked as exercises, and they typically contain errors or inconsistencies that demonstrate the student's developing skill. The truncated king lists are accurate. The orthography is correct. The numbers match other manuscripts. These are not student errors, they are professional copies. A third possibility is that these tablets reflect the contents of the archives they were copied from. Not every archive held a complete version of the king list. Some cities kept only the portions relevant to their own dynastic claims. Kish might preserve the dynasties of Kish in detail, while abbreviating or omitting Uruk's rulers. Uruk might do the reverse. The truncated manuscripts might represent local versions of a longer tradition, each city preserving what mattered to its own institutional memory. This interpretation is supported by the distribution of manuscripts. The most complete versions of the King List, the Weld Blundell Prism, the UCBC 9/1819 tablet from Berkeley, and MS 2855 in the Schoyen collection, were not found in royal archives. They were found in private collections, scholastic contexts, or secondary deposits. The fragmentary versions, by contrast, come from temple and administrative archives where bureaucratic records were stored. The complete versions were reference texts. The fragmentary versions were working documents used for specific administrative or ideological purposes within a city's governance structure. What this suggests is that the Sumerian King List was not a single canonical text. It was a tradition, maintained across multiple archives, copied in different forms depending on the needs of the institution doing the copying. Some scribes copied the entire tradition from the earliest antediluvian kings to their own present. Others copied only the dynasties that preceded their city's current ruling house. Still others copied only the section relevant to a particular legal or ritual claim. The incompleteness of these tablets does not represent ignorance of the full tradition. It represents selection. The scribes knew there was more, but they did not need more. The tablet served its purpose as a fragment, it was filed as a fragment, and it remained a fragment for 3,000 years. There is no evidence that any scribe ever attempted to synthesize all the fragments into one authoritative version. Even the longest versions, the Weld Blundell Prism, which is the most complete, acknowledge that they are compilations. The colophon on the prism states that the scribe consulted multiple earlier sources. He did not claim to have resolved contradictions or created a unified narrative. He simply copied what he found, in the order he found it, and noted where his sources diverged. This lack of editorial synthesis is striking. In other textual traditions, the Hebrew Bible, the Greek histories, the Roman annals, later editors combined, harmonized, and standardized earlier sources. Contradictions were reconciled, alternate versions were merged, a single authoritative edition emerged. But the Sumerian King List resisted this process. Every manuscript that survives is a copy, and every copy reflects the particular concerns and limitations of the scribe who made it. The tradition was never standardized, it remained plural. What this plurality preserves is not a single historical claim, but a method of remembering. The scribes were not asserting that this king followed that king in a single unbroken sequence. They were asserting that these kings were remembered, that their reigns were recorded, and that the records were worth preserving even when incomplete. The list was not a narrative, it was an archive of archives, a compilation of what earlier archives had contained, copied forward not to tell a story, but to prevent the earlier records from being lost. The question this raises is, what did the original archives look like? The earliest king lists date to the early dynastic III period, roughly 2500 BCE. But the texts claim to record events far older, rulers from before the flood, dynasties from the 4th millennium BCE, cities that existed in the Ubaid period. If the scribes were copying from earlier sources, those sources would have been written in earlier forms of cuneiform, or perhaps in a proto-literate notational system that preceded full cuneiform script. The early tablets from Uruk, dating to 3300 to 3000 BCE, are pictographic, not phonetic. They record quantities and categories, but not grammatical sentences. A king list could not have been written in that script. So either the sources were oral traditions later transcribed, or they were written in a form of cuneiform that developed between 3000 and 2500 BCE and has since been lost. The scribes offer no explanation. They do not say where the information came from. They do not say how they verified it. They do not say why some dynasties are recorded in detail and others are mentioned in a single line. The tablets simply present the list, incomplete and unexplained, as if the act of copying was justification enough, and perhaps it was. The archives of Mesopotamia were not modern historical projects. They were institutional memories, maintained not for narrative coherence, but for administrative and ritual continuity. The king list was part of that continuity. It was evidence that kingship had a history, that it had passed through cities and dynasties, that it was older than the scribes who recorded it. Whether it was complete or accurate was less important than whether it was preserved. What remains now are these fragments, fired and filed, truncated but intentional, copied across centuries without apology. The tablets refuse to explain themselves, they simply persist. The lowest occupational levels of Eridu, excavated between 1946 and 1949, contain architectural remains that date to approximately 5400 BCE, well into the Ubaid period. Temple Level 17, the earliest identified structure, is a small rectangular building measuring roughly 4 by 5 meters. It contains a central platform, an offering table, and a niche that likely held a cult statue or votive objects. The walls are mud brick, the floor is stamped earth, and there is evidence of burning consistent with ritual activity, offerings consumed by fire. The building is oriented northwest to southeast, a pattern repeated in every subsequent temple built atop it over the next 2,000 years. Temple Level 16, built directly on the ruins of 17, is slightly larger. The platform is more defined, the niche is more elaborate, and the walls are thicker. By Temple Level 8, dated to approximately 4500 BCE, the structure has grown to 15 by 20 meters, with multiple internal chambers, a central hall, and an exterior courtyard. The orientation remains constant, the platform remains in the same position. The building is clearly a temple, and it is clearly part of a continuous tradition. But nothing in the architectural remains indicates kingship. There are no palaces, there are no fortifications, There are no administrative complexes that suggest centralized political authority. The early Ubaid period at Eridu was organized around the temple, not the throne. The same pattern appears at Uruk, excavated extensively by the German Archaeological Institute between 1912 and 1913, and again from 1928 onward. The earliest levels, Uruk 18 through 12, date to the late Ubaid and early Uruk periods, roughly 4,500 to 3,500 BCE. The architecture is dominated by monumental temple complexes, large rectangular buildings with columned halls, decorated facades, and extensive storage facilities. These are not residential structures, they are public, institutional, and highly organized. But there is no associated palace architecture. There are no royal tombs. There are no inscriptions identifying kings. The texts that do exist, early pictographic tablets from Uruk IV and III, dating to around 3,300 BCE, record economic transactions, barley delivered, animals counted, labour assigned. They are temple records, not royal decrees. Kingship, as an identifiable institution, does not appear in the archaeological record until the early dynastic I period, roughly 2,900 BCE. This is when the first royal tombs appear, at and later at Kish. This is when the first monumental palace structures are built, distinct from temple complexes. This is when inscriptions begin to use the term lugal in administrative and dedicatory contexts. Before this, the texts use N, lord, priest-ruler, or NC, governor, city manager. These titles imply authority, but not kingship in the sense the later texts describe. What this archaeological gap suggests is that cities existed for centuries, perhaps millennia, before kingship arrived. Eridu was occupied continuously from 5,400 BCE onward, Uruk from 4,500 BCE, from at least 4,000 BCE. But kingship does not appear in material form until 2,900 BCE. That is a gap of 1,500 to 2,000 years, depending on the site. During that time, the cities grew, populations increased, temples expanded, trade networks developed, writing was invented. But kings did not rule. Something else did. Temple hierarchies, council assemblies, clan elders, or distributed forms of governance that left no monumental trace. Then suddenly, kingship appears. Royal tombs at dated to approximately 2,600 BCE, contain extraordinarily rich burials: gold, lapis lazuli, carnelian, cylinder seals, and evidence of human sacrifice. These are not the graves of priests. These are the graves of rulers whose authority exceeded the religious sphere. The objects buried with them include weapons, socketed axes, daggers, spearheads, items associated with warfare and coercion, not ritual. The tombs are located outside the temple precincts, in separate cemeteries reserved for elite burials. The dead are not interred beneath temple floors, as priests were. They are interred in their own necropolis. The institution they represent is distinct. At Kish, excavations conducted by the Field Museum and Oxford between 1923 and 1933 uncovered a large mud brick platform identified as a palace, dated to early dynastic II, roughly 2750 BCE. The structure includes storage rooms, administrative offices, and residential quarters, all organized around central courtyards. It is adjacent to, but separate from, the temple complex. This spatial separation reflects institutional separation. The palace governs, the temple sanctifies. Both exist, but they are not the same. Inscriptions from early dynastic III, approximately 2500 BCE, begin to list kings by name. A stone bowl from names Meskalamdug, identified as Lugal. A vase from Kish names Enma Baragesi, also called Lugal, and states that he defeated Elam, a military claim, not a religious one. These are the earliest securely dated references to individuals holding the title of king. Before this, the title does not appear. The rulers of earlier periods, whoever they were not called kings. This raises a chronological problem. The Sumerian King List places Alulim, the first king, in Eridu before the flood. It places Enmebaragesi of Kish after the flood in the first dynasty of Kish. Enmebaragesi is archaeologically attested. His name appears on inscribed objects dated to approximately 2600 BCE. The King List says he ruled 900 years. That number is not archaeologically plausible, but his existence is confirmed. He was a real person, a real king, at a real city. The list is anchored, at least at this point, to historical reality. But the kings before him, Etana of Kish, who ruled 1,560 years, or Enmerkar of Uruk, who ruled 420 years, are not archaeologically confirmed. No inscriptions name them. No tombs can be securely assigned to them. They exist only in the textual tradition. And the kings before them, the antediluvian rulers of Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, exist only as names and numbers in a list that every later scribe copied without alteration. If kingship first appeared around 2900 BCE, and Enmebaragesi ruled around 2600 BCE, then the early dynastic period accounts for, at most, 3 or 4 centuries of actual kingship before the textual record stabilizes. But the King List claims kingship existed for tens of thousands of years before that. Either the scribes were recording something that did not exist, or they were recording something that existed in a form the archaeological record does not capture. There is a third possibility, that kingship, as the texts describe it, was not the same as the political authority visible in early dynastic palaces and tombs. The term Nam-Lugal might have referred to a concept, a status, or a form of legitimacy that preceded the institution of kingship as we recognize it. The long reigns might have been records of something else, dynastic houses, priestly lineages, or collective governance structures that the later scribes translated into the language of kingship because that was the only administrative vocabulary they had. The texts do not clarify this. They do not explain what kingship meant in Eridu in 28,800 BCE, if that date is taken literally, or in whatever earlier period the figure represents symbolically. They simply state that kingship was there, that it was held by named individuals, that it lasted for recorded lengths of time, and that it later moved elsewhere. The archaeology shows that something was there: temples, cities, organized populations, long-term continuity. But it does not show kings. It shows cities before memory stabilized into written form. It shows governance without palaces, authority without thrones, and continuity that outlasted the arrival of the institution the texts claim was first. What this gap suggests is that the King List was not recording political history. It was recording institutional memory, an inherited claim that kingship had always existed, even when the physical evidence for it had not yet appeared. The scribes were writing backward from their own present, projecting the institution they knew onto a past that may have been organized very differently. Or they were copying forward from sources that described something real, something that existed in the early cities, but that left no trace we can recognize. The cities were there. The memory was there. The question is whether the kings were. At Ur, excavations led by Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934 identified a layer of water-laid silt in the stratigraphic sequence approximately 3.5 meters below the surface of the royal cemetery. The layer measured between 2 and 3 meters in thickness, depending on the location of the trench. It was composed of clean alluvial clay, sterile, without potsherds, without ash, without occupation debris. Above it and below it were layers of continuous habitation, mud brick architecture, trash pits, hearths and pottery. The silt layer represented a pause. Water had covered the site, deposited sediment, and then receded. Afterward, occupation resumed. Woolley initially interpreted this layer as evidence of the biblical flood described in Genesis. He announced the discovery in 1929 under the headline, "We have found the flood." But subsequent analysis complicated that conclusion. The silt layer at Ur was not uniform across the site. Some trenches encountered it, others did not. It appeared in some areas of the city, but not in others, suggesting a localized inundation rather than a universal deluge. Radiocarbon dating, conducted decades later on organic material from above and below the silt, placed the deposit sometime in the Ubaid period, roughly 4000 to 3500 BCE. A similar flood layer was identified at Uruk during excavations in the 1930s. It appeared in the Iana precinct, between architectural levels associated with the late Ubaid and early Uruk periods. The layer was thinner than at Ur, roughly half a metre, but it showed the same characteristics: water-laid sediment, no cultural material, a clear interruption in occupation. Above and below, the stratigraphy was intact. The flood had occurred, but the city had not been abandoned. Construction resumed almost immediately, in some cases directly on top of the silt layer, without any apparent gap in time. At Kish, excavations by the Field Museum and Oxford in the 1920s uncovered another flood stratum, this one between early dynastic 1 and 2 levels, dated to approximately 2900 BCE. At Shurapak, the German Oriental Society identified a similar deposit in levels dated to roughly 2750 BCE. At Lagash, French excavations in the 19th century noted water-deposited layers between Ubaid and early dynastic strata. At Nineveh, early soundings revealed comparable silt layers. At Farah, ancient Shurapak, flood deposits appeared in multiple levels across different periods. None of these flood layers align chronologically. The silt at Ur dates to the Ubaid period. The silt at Kish dates to early dynastic 1. The silt at Shurapak dates to early dynastic 2. They are separated by centuries, sometimes millennia. They represent different events, different floods, different inundations, different pauses in occupation caused by the Tigris and Euphrates overflowing their banks during seasonal high water. Southern Mesopotamia is a floodplain. Flooding was not exceptional, it was regular, expected, and survivable. The cities were built to accommodate it. Mud brick architecture was raised on platforms. Temples were constructed on artificial mounds. Streets were graded to channel water away from residential areas. Flooding was part of the environment, not a catastrophic rupture. But the Sumerian King List treats the flood as a singular, dividing event. The text states, "The flood swept over." Then it states, "After the flood had swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish." The flood separates the antediluvian kings, those who ruled before, from the post-diluvian dynasties that follow. It is the only event in the entire King List that is described narratively rather than numerically. It is not assigned a duration. It is not given a reign length. It simply occurs, and afterward, everything changes. The language used is Amaru Ba'ur-Ra. The flood swept over. The verb ur means to sweep, to drag, to carry away. It is the same verb used to describe wind moving across a field, water eroding a riverbank, or an army sweeping through a city. It implies totality, not localized damage. The flood is described as something that covered the land, not something that affected one city or one region. The phrasing is consistent across all versions of the King List. It is not varied, not elaborated, not explained. It is stated as fact. What is absent from the text is any description of survival. The flood sweeps over. Then kingship descends again. There is no mention of how kingship survived the flood, or who preserved it, or how the post-Diluvian kings knew about the antediluvian kings. The list does not say that Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero mentioned in other texts, carried the records forward. It does not say that the gods preserved the knowledge. It does not say that the later scribes reconstructed the list from fragments. It simply resumes. The silence is complete. This silence is unusual. Other Mesopotamian flood narratives, Atrahasis, the Eridu Genesis, the Gilgamesh flood story, describe survival in detail. A hero is warned by a god. He builds a boat. He loads it with animals, craftsmen, and seed. The flood comes. The boat survives. The hero makes offerings. The gods relent. The world is repopulated. These are narratives of continuity. They explain how knowledge, culture, and life persisted through catastrophe. The King List does not provide this. It simply asserts that kingship existed before the flood, stopped during the flood, and resumed afterward in a new city. The question this raises is whether the flood in the King List refers to the same event described in the flood narratives. The flood in Atrahasis is caused by divine decree. The gods decide to destroy humanity because it has become too numerous and too noisy. The flood in the Eridu Genesis is also divinely initiated, but the god Enki warns Ziusudra, who survives and is granted immortality. These are theological stories. They explain why the flood happened and why it ended. The flood in the King List is not explained. It is simply recorded. It swept over. Then it was over. The text provides no cause, no survivor narrative, no divine intervention. It is treated as a historical marker, not a mythological event. If the flood in the King List corresponds to any of the physical flood layers identified at Sumerian sites, it cannot correspond to all of them because they do not align chronologically. It might correspond to one particularly severe inundation that affected multiple cities in the same century, creating a collective memory of disruption. But no single flood layer in the archaeological record matches this description. The floods were local, sequential, and survivable. None of them interrupted occupation for more than a generation. None of them erased the cities. None of them required kingship to be re-established from scratch. Yet the King List treats the flood as an absolute break. The dynasties before are counted in tens of thousands of years. The dynasties after are counted in hundreds or thousands. The numbers change. The cities change. Eridu held kingship before the flood. Kish held it after. The continuity is institutional, not geographical. Kingship moved, it did not die. But it did not stay in the same place either. What this suggests is that the flood in the King List was not a physical event, or not only a physical event. It was a chronological boundary, a point at which the scribes marking the transition from one kind of record to another. Before the flood, the sources were different, older, less detailed, more numerical than narrative. After the flood, the sources were more reliable, more numerous, and more closely aligned with the scribe's own administrative experience. The flood was not the event that ended the antediluvian period. It was the marker the scribes used to separate knowable history from inherited tradition. But they did not say this. They copied the flood as a fact. They copied the antediluvian kings as facts. They copied the post-diluvian kings as facts. And they filed the entire sequence in the same administrative archive, alongside grain receipts and land surveys, as if it were all the same kind of information. The silence between the flood layers, archaeological, textual, chronological, remains. The texts do not bridge it. They simply record that it was crossed. The Sumerian language is a linguistic isolate. It has no known relatives, no cognates in neighbouring language families, and no clear point of origin. It is not Semitic, like Akkadian or Hebrew. It is not Indo-European, like Hittite or Greek. It is not Elamite, despite geographic proximity to Elam. It is structurally unique, agglutinative, ergative, absolutive in case marking, with a complex system of verb prefixes and suffixes that encode subject, object, tense, mood, and spatial orientation within a single word. It appears fully formed in the earliest written texts from Uruk, dated to approximately 3300 BCE, with no evidence of a prior developmental stage. This linguistic isolation raises a question. If Sumerian developed in Mesopotamia, where are the earlier, simpler stages? If it arrived in Mesopotamia from elsewhere, where did it come from? The texts provide no answer. The language is simply there, in use, functioning as the administrative and literary medium of the first urban civilization in southern Mesopotamia. By the time it is first attested in writing, it already possesses a large vocabulary, complex grammar, and a standardized orthographic system. It is not a primitive language, it is a mature one. The earliest written Sumerian texts are economic in nature, records of barley, livestock, labor, and land. The tablets from Uruk IV, dated to 3300 to 3100 BCE, use a combination of pictographic signs and numerical notation to track the flow of goods through temple institutions. The script is not yet phonetic. The signs represent objects and quantities, not sounds, but the underlying language, the grammar that organizes the signs into meaningful sequences, is already Sumerian. The syntax is recognizable. The case markers are present. The verb prefixes follow the patterns seen in later, fully phonetic texts. The language existed before the script that recorded it. By the early dynastic period, roughly 2900 to 2350 BCE, Sumerian is written phonetically. Signs represent syllables, not just objects. Grammatical particles are spelled out. Verbs are fully conjugated. Literary texts begin to appear: hymns, myths, proverbs, king lists. The orthography is still evolving, but the language is stable. It does not change significantly between early dynastic 3 and the end of the Ur-3 period, a span of roughly 600 years. This stability suggests a language that was already standardized, already codified, already functioning as a prestige dialect, used for administration and ritual across multiple cities. But the terms used for kingship in Sumerian are older than the institution of kingship as it appears in the archaeological record. The word lugal, great man, is attested in the earliest lexical lists, compilations of vocabulary used to train scribes. The word nam lugal, kingship, appears in early dynastic administrative texts, even though the cities that produced those texts did not yet have kings in the sense later periods understood them. The vocabulary for kingship existed before the institution it described was fully established. The language preserved concepts that preceded their political realization. Another term, en, appears even earlier. It means lord or priest-ruler, and it is used in texts from the Uruk period to describe the highest authority in a city. But en is not the same as lugal. An en is a religious figure, someone who mediates between the gods and the city. A lugal is a political figure, someone who commands armies, builds walls, and enforces laws. The distinction is clear in later texts, but in the earliest periods the terms overlap. Some rulers are called en, others are called lugal. A few are called both. The language had words for authority before it had settled on what kind of authority was being described. A third term, ensi, appears frequently in early dynastic and later texts. It is usually translated as governor or city ruler, but its etymology is uncertain. Some scholars derive it from en, suggesting it originally meant priest-lord. Others suggest it comes from a compound meaning righteous leader or steward. The ambiguity in the term's origin reflects ambiguity in the role itself. An ensi could be subordinate to a lugal, or independent, or both, depending on the city and the period. The language had multiple words for rule because rule took multiple forms. The Sumerian King List uses lugal consistently for the rulers it records. It does not call them en or ensi. This is significant. The scribes were making a claim about the nature of the authority these figures held. They were kings, not priests. They held political power, not just religious status. But the language they used to describe this power predated the institution. The word lugal was older than the kings it named. This temporal gap between the emergence of the word and the emergence of the institution suggests that the concept of kingship was linguistic before it was political. The Sumerians had a word for king before they had kings. They had a word for kingship before they had a system of royal succession. The vocabulary was inherited, not invented. It came from somewhere earlier, preserved in the language even when the reality it described was not yet present. The scribes who compiled the King List in the Ur-3 period were writing in Sumerian, but Sumerian was no longer a spoken language. By 2100 BCE, Akkadian, a Semitic language, had become the dominant spoken language in Mesopotamia. Sumerian survived as a liturgical and scholarly language, used in temples and scribal schools, but not in daily life. It was the Latin of ancient Mesopotamia, a language of learning, tradition, and authority, maintained by scribes who studied it as a second language. This means that the scribes who copied the King List were not writing in their native tongue. They were writing in a dead language, copying texts composed in an earlier period when Sumerian was still spoken. The act of copying preserved not just the content of the list, but the language in which it was written. The scribes could have translated the list into Akkadian. They did not. They preserved it in Sumerian because Sumerian was the language of the tradition. To translate it would have been to break the chain of transmission. The vocabulary they preserved included archaic terms that were no longer in common use even in scribal Sumerian. Words for weights and measures that had been obsolete for centuries. Names of cities that no longer existed. Titles for officials whose roles had changed. The language of the King List was not the language of the Ur-3 bureaucracy. It was older. The scribes were copying a text that was already archaic when they copied it, written in a language that was already ancient when they learned it. This linguistic layering, Sumerian preserved by Akkadian-speaking scribes, who copied texts written by earlier Sumerian-speaking scribes, who themselves were copying still earlier sources, creates a chain of transmission that extends back to the origins of writing itself. The King List was not composed in the Ur-3 period. It was compiled then from sources that were older, and those sources in turn drew on earlier material that may have been oral, may have been written in a now lost script, or may have existed in forms the later scribes no longer fully understood. But they copied it anyway. They preserved the language because the language was the record. To change the words would have been to lose the information. What this suggests is that the Sumerian King List, as it survives, is not a text. It is a translation of a translation of a translation, passed through generations of scribes who copied what they found without fully understanding what they were copying. The language preserved concepts that were older than administration, older than writing, older than the cities in which the scribes worked. Kingship was one of those concepts. The word existed. The memory existed. Whether the institution existed in the form the texts describe remains unclear, but the language treated it as if it had. The word Nam-Lugal was older than the evidence for what it named. At Uruk, the monumental architecture of the late Uruk period, roughly 3,300 to 3000 BCE, includes the White Temple, built atop a massive artificial platform known as the Anu Ziggurat. The temple itself is small, measuring approximately 18 by 22 meters, but the platform beneath it rises 16 meters above the surrounding plain. The construction required tens of thousands of mud bricks, organized labor on a scale that implies centralized planning, and resources drawn from a wide agricultural hinterland. The building is public, monumental, and visible from kilometers away. It is a statement of collective effort and institutional authority. But it is a temple, not a palace. No palace has been securely identified in the Uruk 4 or 3 levels. There are large buildings, multi-room structures with courtyards, storage areas, and administrative spaces, but none that match the architectural signatures of later royal residences. There are no throne rooms, no fortified compounds, no private quarters distinct from public or ritual spaces. The monumental architecture of early Uruk is religious, not royal. Authority was expressed through the temple, not the throne. This pattern holds at other early sites. At Eridu, the sequence of superimposed temples spans millennia, but there is no corresponding sequence of palaces. At Tel Brak in northern Mesopotamia, the so-called Eye Temple, dated to the mid-4th millennium BCE, is a massive public building with thousands of votive figurines, but no associated palace architecture. At Tepe Gowra, also in the north, monumental temples appear in levels 13 through 11, dated to approximately 3500 BCE, but residential structures remain small and undifferentiated. There is no elite quarter, no royal precinct, no architectural evidence of kingship. The first clear palace architecture appears in the early dynastic II period, roughly 2750 BCE, at Kish. The structure, labelled Palace A by excavators, includes a large central courtyard surrounded by storage rooms, workshops, and residential quarters. It is adjacent to, but separate from, the temple complex. The separation is architectural and symbolic. The palace governs. The temple sanctifies. Both exist, but they are not the same building. This spatial distinction reflects institutional distinction. Kingship, as an institution, is separate from priesthood. But during the centuries before Palace A was built, between 3300 and 2750 BCE, authority was expressed differently. The temples were the centres of power. They controlled land, managed labour, stored surplus, and organised trade. The early tablets from Uruk record temple administration, not royal decrees. The officials named in the texts are temple functionaries, overseers of barley, managers of livestock, supervisors of craft workshops. There is no king mentioned. There is no royal household. The institution does not yet exist, or if it exists, it has not yet left architectural evidence. This absence is significant. Palaces are highly visible in the archaeological record. They are large, centrally located, and built with durable materials. When kingship becomes a dominant institution, palaces appear immediately, at Kish, at at Mari, at Ebla. The buildings are unmistakable, but before 2750 BCE, they are absent. Authority existed, cities functioned, temples were built, trade networks expanded, but the form of authority was not royal. So where did the kings of the Sumerian King List live? If Alulim ruled Eridu for 28,800 years, where was his palace? If Enmerkar ruled Uruk for 420 years, where did he hold court? The texts name cities and rulers, but the cities show no palaces. The architectural record does not align with the textual tradition. Either the texts are recording rulers who did not exist, or the rulers existed in a form that did not require monumental residential architecture. One possibility is that early kingship was itinerant. The king moved between cities, between temple complexes, between seasonal residences that left no permanent trace. This model is attested in later periods. The kings of the Akkadian Empire, for example, did not rule from a single fixed capital. Sargon built Akkad, but his successors moved frequently between cities, Nippur, Ur, Lagash, Umma, wherever administrative or military needs required their presence. If early kingship functioned similarly, the king would not have needed a permanent palace. He would have ruled from temple complexes, using sacred architecture as the seat of authority. Another possibility is that early kingship was collective. The term lugal might have referred not to a single individual, but to a council, a ruling assembly, or a rotating leadership structure. In this model, kingship would be an office, not a person. Multiple individuals could hold the title lugal simultaneously, each governing a different district or serving in a different capacity. The king list might be recording the duration of a ruling institution, not the lifespan of a single ruler. This would explain the long reign lengths, The numbers would represent the length of a dynastic period, a collective rule, or an institutional continuity, rather than an individual's life. A third possibility is that the early kings mentioned in the king list were not political rulers at all. They were priests, ritual specialists, or custodians of sacred tradition. The term lugal was later applied to them retroactively by scribes who understood kingship as a political institution and assumed it had always existed in that form. The scribes were projecting their own administrative reality backward onto a past that was organized differently. The early rulers of Eridu and Uruk may have been temple officials, religious authorities, or lineage heads whose roles were redefined as kingship once that institution emerged. The texts do not clarify this. They do not explain what the antediluvian kings did, how they ruled, or where they lived. They simply list names and reign lengths. The later kings, those from the early dynastic period onward, are attested archaeologically. Their palaces exist. Their inscriptions survive. Their wars are recorded. But the earlier kings exist only in the textual tradition. They are names without palaces, rulers without thrones, kings without kingdoms. At least, not kingdoms in the form later periods would recognize. What this architectural absence suggests is that kingship, as the Sumerian King List records it, was not always expressed in physical form. It was a status, a title, a form of authority that could exist without monumental architecture. The early cities were organized around temples, not palaces. Authority was religious, not royal. But the scribes who compiled the king list treated that authority as kingship nonetheless. They called it Nam Lugal. They listed rulers by name. They recorded reign lengths. They treated it as continuous with the kingship they themselves served, even though the physical form of that authority had changed. The question is whether the scribes were right. Were the temple officials of the Uruk period kings? Were the early rulers of Eridu exercising kingship, even if they did not live in palaces? Or were the scribes imposing a later institution onto an earlier reality that did not yet conform to it? The architecture does not answer this. It simply shows that authority existed before palaces, governance existed before kings, and cities functioned for centuries without the institution the texts claim was first. The palaces without palaces remain absent. The kings without thrones remain unnamed in the physical record. And the list continues, recording reigns that have no corresponding ruins. The Sumerian numerical system is sexagesimal, based on the number 60. This is the system that gives us 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, and 360 degrees in a circle. It is a highly efficient system for calculation, divisible by many factors, and well suited to astronomical observation, which requires precise division of circular motion. The Sumerians did not invent this system arbitrarily. They inherited it, standardized it, and used it consistently across all areas of administration: weights, measures, time, and geometry. The numbers recorded in the Sumerian King List follow this system. The reign lengths are not random. They are structured around multiples of 60, or multiples of larger units derived from 60. The number 3600, written as Shah in Sumerian, is 60 squared. It appears frequently in the antediluvian section of the King List. Alulim's reign of 28,800 years equals 8 Shah. Al-Aljar's reign of 36,000 years equals 10 Shah. Enmen-Luana's reign of 43,200 years equals 12 Shah. These are not arbitrary figures, they are calculated. The number 1,200 also appears repeatedly. It is a third of 3,600, or 20 times 60. Several post-Diluvian kings, rulers of Kish, Uruk, and Ur, are assigned reigns of 1,200 years, or multiples thereof. The number 900 appears as well, a quarter of 3,600. The reign of Enmebaragesi, one of the few historically attested early dynastic kings, is given as 900 years. His son Aga ruled 625 years, a number that divides neatly into 25 groups of 25, another structured figure. These numbers do not resemble natural lifespans. They resemble calculations. They are too regular, too divisible, too patterned to be estimates or approximations. They are the product of a system, a method of quantifying time that uses standard units and follows consistent rules. The question is, what were these units measuring? One possibility is that the numbers represent something other than solar years. The Sumerian calendar was lunar, with months of 29 or 30 days. A lunar year is approximately 354 days, roughly 11 days shorter than a solar year. Over long periods, this discrepancy accumulates. A reign recorded as 1,200 lunar years would correspond to approximately 1,164 solar years. A reign of 28,800 lunar years would correspond to roughly 27,965 solar years. The numbers change, but they remain implausibly long. Another possibility is that the numbers are symbolic, representing not literal time, but a kind of ritual or genealogical measure. In some ancient systems, years could refer to generations, regnal periods, or ritual cycles. A king who ruled for 900 years might have presided over 900 annual festivals, or 900 seasonal rituals, or represented the 9th generation of a dynastic lineage. The number would still be a measure, but not of solar time. It would be a count of repetitions, cycles, or iterations of a recurring event. A third possibility is that the numbers are archival, that they represent not the duration of a reign, but the number of records associated with that reign. If a king's administration produced 1,200 tablets, or 1,200 sealed documents, or 1,200 entries in a master ledger, the scribes might have recorded this as 1,200 years, using the word for year as shorthand for documented unit of time. In this interpretation, the King List would be a catalogue of archives, not a chronology of reigns. The numbers would measure not time, but documentation. None of these interpretations are confirmed by the text itself. The Sumerian King List does not explain its numbers. It simply records them, using the word mu, year, consistently. The scribes treat the numbers as durations, not as symbols or counts of something else. They list kings sequentially, add reign lengths, and note when kingship moved from one city to another. The structure is chronological, the language is temporal, but the numbers do not behave like solar years. What makes the numbers even more perplexing is their internal consistency. The total reign length for the antediluvian kings, according to the Weld-Blundell prism, is 241,200 years. This is exactly 67 times 3,600. The number is not rounded, it is precise. The scribes calculated it. They added the individual reign lengths and arrived at a sum that itself follows the sexagesimal structure. This suggests that the numbers were not preserved because they were traditional or sacred. They were preserved because they were part of a system, and the system required them to add up correctly. The same precision appears in the post-Diluvian section. The first dynasty of Kish, according to the Weld-Blundell prism, totals 24,510 years, 3 months, and 3.5 days. The specificity is striking. The scribes did not round to the nearest hundred, or the nearest year, or even the nearest month. They recorded fractions of days. This is the behavior of accountants, not mythographers. The numbers were treated as data, and the data was expected to be exact. But exact measurement of what? If these are solar years, the numbers are impossible. No human lives 1,200 years. No dynasty survives 24,510 years without interruption. The cities themselves, archaeologically attested, continuously occupied, do not show 24,510 years of stratification. The numbers cannot be literal solar years and also be accurate records of real events. Something else is being measured. One clue comes from astronomical texts. The Mesopotamians observed the heavens with extraordinary precision. They tracked the movements of Venus, recorded lunar eclipses, and calculated the length of the solar year to within minutes of modern measurements. They used the sexagesimal system to divide celestial cycles, 360 degrees in a circle, 60 minutes in a degree, 60 seconds in a minute. The same system that organizes the King List also organizes the sky. It is possible that the reign lengths in the King List are connected to astronomical cycles. A Shah, 3600, could represent a cycle of celestial observation, a period after which certain planetary alignments repeat. The Sumerians knew about precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that causes the position of stars to shift over millennia. A full precessional cycle takes roughly 25,920 years, close to the total of 24,510 years for the first dynasty of Kish. The numbers might be recording not political reigns, but astronomical periods, preserved in the language of kingship because kingship was the institutional framework through which time was officially measured. But again, the text does not say this. It does not mention stars, planets, or cycles. It lists kings. It assigns them reign lengths. It states that they ruled cities. The astronomical interpretation is plausible, but it is not explicit. The numbers remain ambiguous, too structured to be random, too large to be literal, too precise to be symbolic. They behave like measurements, but they measure something the text does not name. What this ambiguity suggests is that the Sumerian King List was compiled by scribes who inherited numbers they no longer fully understood. They knew the numbers were important. They knew they needed to be preserved exactly. They knew they followed a system. But they may not have known what the system originally measured. They copied the numbers because the numbers were part of the tradition, and the tradition was authoritative. To alter the numbers would have been to break the chain of transmission. So they copied them exactly, even when the figures no longer corresponded to any reality they could verify. The numbers that do not behave like years were preserved as years, because that was the only vocabulary the scribes had. The system remained intact, but its meaning was lost. Tablet YBC 4766, held in the Yale Babylonian collection, contains a fragment of a legal text from the Ur-3 period, dated to approximately 2100 BCE. It records a dispute over land ownership between two parties, mediated by an official identified as Ensi, governor. The dispute is resolved by consulting earlier records, older tablets that documented the original land grant. The text does not mention a king. The authority invoked is not royal decree, but archival precedent. The land belongs to one party because older records say it does. The system of justice is based on continuity of documentation, not on the will of a ruler. This pattern is typical of Ur-3 administration. The state maintained vast archives, hundreds of thousands of tablets documenting grain shipments, livestock inventories, labour assignments, and legal transactions. Justice was not decreed. It was discovered by consulting the archives. A judge did not rule based on personal authority. He ruled based on what the records showed. If the records were ambiguous, additional records were consulted. If no records existed, the case was unresolved. The absence of documentation was the absence of justice. The system was archival, not personal. But the kings listed in the Sumerian King List ruled for periods far longer than any archive could plausibly cover. Alulim ruled 28,800 years. Alaljar ruled 36,000 years. If these numbers are taken literally, how were their reigns documented? How were disputes resolved during a reign lasting 10,000 years? How were records maintained, transferred, and preserved across such spans? The Ur-3 scribes managed their archives carefully. Tablets were filed by year, by district, by type of transaction. They were stored in mud brick chambers, labelled with summary tablets that listed the contents of each room. When a tablet was damaged or worn, it was copied, and the copy was filed alongside the original. The system was designed for continuity. But even the most carefully maintained archive has limits. Mud brick erodes. Clay tablets crack. Rooms flood. Archives burn. The longest continuously maintained archive in Mesopotamia, the temple archive at Nippur, spans approximately 800 years from the early dynastic period through the end of the Ur-III dynasty. That is the upper limit of institutional memory based on physical records. 800 years, not 28,800. So if the antediluvian kings ruled for tens of thousands of years, their reigns were not documented in the way Ur-III reigns were documented. There were no annual tablets. There were no multi-year account reconciliations. There were no judicial precedents that could be consulted. Either the reigns were not real, or they were recorded in a way that did not survive, or they were recorded in a form the later scribes translated into the language of administration because that was the only framework they had. One possibility is that early kingship was documented orally. Names and reign lengths were memorized, recited, and passed down through lineages of scribes or priests. When writing was invented, the oral tradition was transcribed, and the numbers were converted into written form using the sexagesimal system. This would explain why the numbers are so regular. They were designed to be memorable, structured in multiples of standard units to make recitation easier. A reign of 10 Shah, 36,000 years, is easier to remember than a reign of 36,427 years. The round numbers reflect the needs of oral transmission, not the precision of written records. But if the tradition was oral, it was preserved with extraordinary accuracy. The reign lengths are consistent across manuscripts. The names do not vary significantly. The order of kings is stable. Oral traditions can be accurate, but they are also flexible. They adapt, shift, and change with each generation. The Sumerian King List does not show this flexibility. It is fixed, standardized, and copied without variation. This suggests that even if the original tradition was oral, it was codified early, written down in a form that later scribes treated as authoritative and unchangeable. Another possibility is that the early reigns were documented using a system that no longer exists. The earliest written records from Mesopotamia, tokens and bullae from the 8th and 7th millennia BCE, were not phonetic. They were symbolic, representing quantities and categories without grammatical sentences. These proto-literate systems could track goods, count animals, and record transactions, but they could not write narratives. If kingship was recorded in such a system, the records would have been numerical, lists of names paired with numbers without explanatory text. When phonetic writing was invented, the numerical records were translated into cuneiform, and the numbers became years, because that was how the later scribes understood measures of time. This interpretation is speculative, but it aligns with the structure of the King List. The text is not narrative. It does not describe what the kings did, how they ruled, or why their reigns ended. It simply lists names and numbers. The format is identical to the earliest economic tablets from Uruk: name, number, name, number. The King List might be a transcription of a much older record-keeping system, preserved in the only form the later scribes knew how to write. What this suggests is that the Sumerian King List is not evidence of how kingship functioned. It is evidence of how kingship was remembered. The scribes were not recording contemporary events. They were compiling inherited information, organizing it into a coherent sequence, and presenting it in the language of their own administrative practice. The numbers were part of that inheritance. They came from older sources, and those older sources were treated as authoritative even when they no longer made sense. The question then becomes, what kind of justice system could function under a king who ruled for 28,800 years? The answer is that it could not, if those years are solar years. But if the numbers represent something else, generational time, ritual cycles, archival periods, then the system makes more sense. A dynasty that lasted 20 generations might be recorded as ruling for 20 cycles, and each cycle might be equivalent to 1,440 years, 24 times 60. The later scribes, reading 20 cycles, would translate it as 28,800 years, because they no longer understood what a cycle meant in the original context. The law before courts would then be the law of lineage, of inherited status, of claims that stretched back through genealogies rather than through calendar years. A landowner would claim his right not by citing a specific date, but by citing an ancestral connection to a ruler in the King List. The judge would consult the list, verify the lineage, and rule accordingly. The King List would function as a legal document, establishing chains of authority that transcended individual lifetimes. This is consistent with how land ownership worked in later Mesopotamia. Land was not owned by individuals. It was held by families, temples, or the state. Ownership was inherited, transferred through generations, and documented in genealogical records. The King List might have served a similar function, not as a chronology of reigns, but as a genealogy of authority, proving that kingship was inherited from earlier rulers in an unbroken line stretching back to the moment it descended from heaven. But the text does not explain this. It simply records names, numbers, and cities. The system it reflects is gone. The justice it documents is no longer practiced. What remains are the numbers, too long to be lifetimes, too structured to be myths, too precise to be errors. The law before courts was the law of the list, and the list is all that survives. Tablet CBS 100673, housed in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, is a medical text from the Ur-3 period, dated to approximately 2100 BCE. It contains prescriptions for treating wounds, fevers, and digestive ailments. The ingredients include plant materials, roots, seeds, leaves, mixed with animal fats, beer, and sometimes crushed minerals. The instructions are precise. Grind the seeds, mix with oil, apply to the wound for 3 days. The text assumes the patient will heal within a predictable time frame. There is no mention of extending life beyond natural limits. There is no reference to prolonging vitality for centuries or millennia. The human body is treated as mortal, subject to injury and decay, healable within ordinary spans of time. This medical text exists in the same archive system that preserved the Sumerian King List. Both were copied by Ur-III scribes. Both were stored in the same temple complexes. Both were treated as authoritative records, but they describe radically different realities. The medical texts assume human lifespans measured in decades. The King List assumes reigns measured in millennia. The two traditions coexist without reconciliation. Other medical tablets from Mesopotamia show similar assumptions. Tablet K 2405 from the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh is a later Assyrian copy of an older Sumerian medical compendium. It includes treatments for aging, remedies for grey hair, failing eyesight, weakened joints. These are described as natural processes, inevitable and treatable only symptomatically. The texts do not suggest that aging can be reversed or that life can be extended indefinitely. The body decays. The texts accept this. Mesopotamian medical practice was sophisticated. Physicians distinguished between different types of illness, those caused by physical injury, those caused by internal imbalance, and those caused by supernatural forces. They used surgical tools, set broken bones, drained abscesses, and prescribed herbal remedies. But they did not claim to extend life beyond natural limits. The medical corpus acknowledges mortality. The King List does not. One possible explanation is that the kings listed in the King List were not human in the same way ordinary people were human. The texts do not say this explicitly, but they imply it by assigning reign lengths far beyond human lifespans. If the kings were understood to be semi-divine, or divinely sustained, or biologically different from the populations they ruled, then the medical texts and the King List would describe different categories of beings. The medical texts apply to ordinary humans. The King List applies to rulers whose longevity was exceptional by divine grant or by nature. But the king list does not describe the kings as gods. The antediluvian rulers are not called gods, they are called kings. The term Lugal is used, not Dingir, god. They are named with Sumerian personal names, Alulim, Alaljar, Enmenluana, not with divine epithets. They rule cities, not heavens. They are located in historical geography, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, not in mythological realms. The text treats them as rulers, not as deities. Their longevity is recorded as a fact, not as a miraculous exception. This creates a contradiction. If the kings were human, the reign lengths are impossible. If they were not human, the texts do not say so. The scribes who copied the king list were the same scribes who copied medical texts, legal codes, and economic records. They knew what ordinary human life looked like. They knew how long people lived. They tracked births, deaths, and inheritances in their administrative tablets. They knew that no one lived 1,200 years, but they copied the king list anyway, without editorial comment, without qualifying the numbers, without marking the text as exceptional. One possibility is that the scribes understood ruling for 1,200 years to mean something other than living for 1,200 years. A king might rule for 1,200 years if his dynasty ruled for 1,200 years, and his name was used as a dynastic title. A king might rule for 1,200 years if his authority was inherited by successors who continued to invoke his name. A king might rule for 1,200 years if his reign was measured not in solar years, but in some other unit, generations, jubilees, ritual cycles. The text would still be accurate. The numbers would still be correct. But the meaning of ruling and the meaning of years would be different from the modern understanding. This interpretation is plausible, but it is not stated. The text does not include a key explaining its terminology. It does not say, years means something other than years. It does not say, ruling means something other than exercising authority. The scribes wrote as if the numbers were straightforward, and later scribes copied them as if they were straightforward. The tradition assumed the text was intelligible, even when the numbers it recorded were incompatible with the medical and biological knowledge the same scribes possessed. Another possibility is that the reign lengths were symbolic, representing not literal durations, but qualities of rule. A king who ruled for 28,800 years might have been understood as ruling perfectly or completely, with 28,800 representing a numerological ideal. A king who ruled for 900 years might have been understood as ruling justly or powerfully, with 900 representing a different symbolic value. The numbers would not be measurements, but evaluations, preserved in numerical form because that was the language of Mesopotamian record-keeping. But this interpretation requires assuming that the scribes were using numbers metaphorically while writing in a documentary register. The rest of the king list is factual. It names real cities, real dynasties, real kings who are attested in other sources. The post-Diluvian section includes kings whose reigns are plausible, whose inscriptions survive, whose monuments still stand. The text transitions smoothly from implausible reign lengths to plausible ones without signalling a change in genre. If the antediluvian section is symbolic, the text does not indicate where the symbolism ends and the history begins. What this suggests is that the scribes were not making a distinction between symbolic and literal, or between mythological and historical. They were recording what they had inherited, and what they had inherited was a tradition that described kings ruling for thousands of years. That tradition coexisted with medical knowledge that described humans dying in decades. The two were not reconciled because they did not need to be. They addressed different questions. The medical texts described how bodies functioned. The king list described how authority was transmitted. One dealt with biology, the other dealt with legitimacy. But the bodies of the kings are absent. There are no royal tombs from the antediluvian period. There are no skeletal remains dated to 28,800 BCE. There are no artifacts inscribed with the names of Alulim or Alaljar. The kings exist only in the textual tradition. If they lived for thousands of years, where are their bodies? If they died, where are they buried? The archaeology of kingship begins in the early dynastic period, with tombs and palaces and inscriptions. Before that, there is nothing but the list. The names persist, but the bodies do not. What this absence suggests is that the kings of the king list were not physical beings whose bodies could be located. They were institutional memories, dynastic names, or ancestral titles. The longevity attributed to them was the longevity of the institution, not the longevity of a biological individual. The medical texts describe bodies, the king list describes offices. The two need not align. Medicine treats the body, kingship transcends it, and the list records that transcendence in numbers that refuse to correspond to human lifespans. In the Sumerian mythological corpus, gods are frequently involved in the establishment of cities, the granting of divine blessings, and the maintenance of cosmic order. But they do not rule cities directly. The god Enlil does not govern Nippur. The god Enki does not govern Eridu. The goddess Inanna does not govern Uruk. These deities are patrons. They protect, empower, and sanctify the cities associated with them. But the actual administration, the day-to-day governance, is carried out by human rulers, kings, governors, or temple officials. The gods authorize kingship. They do not perform it. This distinction is consistent across Mesopotamian religious texts. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the god Marduk defeats Tiamat and establishes cosmic order. But after creating the world, Marduk does not rule it himself. He assigns responsibilities to other gods, and eventually he creates humans to perform labor and maintain the temples. The gods are removed from direct management. They delegate. Kingship is the mechanism of that delegation. The king rules on behalf of the gods, but the gods themselves do not rule. In the instructions of Shuruppak, one of the oldest Sumerian wisdom texts, the city ruler Shuruppak advises his son Ziusudra on proper conduct. The advice is practical: how to manage wealth, how to avoid disputes, how to maintain one's reputation. There is no mention of divine intervention in governance. The text assumes that the ruler is responsible for justice and order, not the gods. The gods may support the ruler, but they do not govern in his place. This separation is also evident in the Sumerian King List. The text states that kingship descended from heaven, but it does not say that gods ruled during the antediluvian period. The rulers listed, Alulim, Alaljar, Enmenluana, are not gods. They are not identified as divine. They are named with Sumerian personal names, assigned to human cities, and recorded as holding kingship. The gods granted kingship, but humans held it. However, the relationship between the gods and kingship is more complex than simple delegation. In Sumerian theology, kingship was itself a divine gift, part of the me, the fundamental principles of civilization that the gods possessed and could bestow on humans. The me included not just kingship, but also priesthood, warfare, justice, music, writing, and craftsmanship. These were not human inventions. They were divine possessions loaned to humanity. A city that held kingship held one of the me. If kingship moved from one city to another, it was because the gods had transferred it. The institution was divinely controlled, even if it was humanly administered. This creates an ambiguity. If kingship is divinely controlled, are the kings who hold it acting on their own authority, or are they instruments of divine will? The texts suggest both. Kings claim divine support in their inscriptions. Enlil gave me kingship, Inanna chose me. But they also claim personal agency. They make decisions, wage wars, build temples, issue laws. They are not passive conduits. They are active rulers. The divine gift does not erase human responsibility. What is notable about the Sumerian King List is what it does not include. It does not list gods as rulers. It does not say that Enlil ruled Nippur before human kings took over. It does not say that Enki governed Eridu before Alulim. The gods are present in Mesopotamian mythology as creators, judges, and arbiters, but they are absent from the king list as rulers. The list begins with human kings, not with divine kings. Kingship descends, but it descends to humans, not to gods first and then to humans. The implication is that humans were always the intended recipients. The gods never ruled, they only authorized. This contrasts with other ancient traditions. In Egyptian theology, the gods did rule. The god Osiris was said to have been a king of Egypt before being killed by Set. The god Horus was his successor, and the human pharaohs were understood as incarnations of Horus. Egyptian kingship was divine because the king was a god. Sumerian kingship was not. The Sumerian king was a human who held divine authority. He was not divine himself. This distinction matters because it affects how the long reign lengths in the king list are interpreted. If the antediluvian kings were understood to be semi-divine or divinely sustained, their longevity might have been attributed to divine intervention. But the texts do not say this. The kings are not described as half-gods. They are not said to have been given immortality. They are simply recorded as ruling for very long periods. The silence is complete. One possible explanation is that the gods' role was passive rather than active. The gods granted kingship at the beginning, when it descended from heaven, but thereafter they did not intervene in individual reigns. The kings ruled according to their own capacity, and their reign lengths were determined by factors the texts do not specify. The gods authorized the institution, but did not micromanage it. This would explain why the gods are absent from the king list as actors. They set the system in motion, and the system continued on its own. But this interpretation conflicts with other Mesopotamian texts, which describe gods intervening constantly in human affairs, granting victories, sending plagues, deposing kings, rewarding piety. The gods were not passive in Mesopotamian theology. They were active, engaged, and often capricious. If they were so involved in the affairs of later kings, why are they absent from the king list's account of earlier kings? The texts do not explain. Another possibility is that the king list represents a different tradition from the mythological texts. The mythological corpus, Enuma Elish, the descent of Inanna, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was literary, composed for recitation, performance, or instruction. The king list was archival, composed for record-keeping and administrative reference. The two served different purposes and drew on different sources. The king list was not a religious text. It was a bureaucratic one. The gods were not included because they were not relevant to the administrative question the list was answering. Who held kingship, in what order, and for how long? This interpretation is supported by the structure of the text. The king list does not include mythological episodes. It does not describe the flood in narrative detail. It does not explain why kingship moved from Eridu to Kish. It does not recount battles, miracles, or divine judgments. It simply lists names, reign lengths, and cities. The format is administrative, not narrative. The gods are absent because the list is not about the gods. It is about the office of kingship and its historical transmission. But even administrative texts in Mesopotamia routinely invoke the gods. Land grants are made by the command of Enlil. Legal judgments are rendered in the presence of the god. Temple accounts record offerings made to the Lady Inanna. The gods are woven into every aspect of Mesopotamian administration, even when the texts are purely bureaucratic. Their absence from the king list is unusual. It suggests that the list was copied from sources that did not include divine references, or that the divine references were stripped out during transmission, or that the scribes who compiled the list were working within a tradition that treated kingship as a human institution, authorized by the gods at the beginning, but administered by humans thereafter, without constant divine involvement. What this leaves is a king list that records human rulers holding a divinely granted office, ruling for durations that exceed human lifespans, in cities that existed before the institution of kingship, is archaeologically visible. The gods do not intervene. The gods do not explain. The gods are assumed, but they are not named. The institution persists. The list records it. And the question of why the gods who authorized kingship did not also govern directly remains unanswered. Tablet YBC 2126, held in the Yale Babylonian collection, is a Sumerian literary composition titled The Instructions of Shuruppak, dated to approximately 2500 BCE in its earliest known form. The text was later copied and recopied throughout the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, and fragments survive from at least 8 different manuscript traditions. The reason so many copies exist is that the text was widely used in scribal education. It was not composed during the Old Babylonian period. It was preserved during that period, copied by students learning to write, and maintained in the scribal curriculum for centuries after the original composition. This pattern, texts composed in the early dynastic or Ur-III periods being copied during the Old Babylonian period, is common across the Mesopotamian textual record. The Sumerian King List follows the same trajectory. The oldest surviving manuscripts date to the Ur-III period, around 2100 BCE, but the text itself claims to record events far older. The scribes who produced these manuscripts were not the original compilers. They were copyists, working from earlier versions that no longer survive. The colophons confirm this. Nur-Ninsabur, the scribe who inscribed the Weld Blundell prism, states explicitly that he copied from older tablets. He did not compose the list. He reproduced it. This act of reproduction, copying older texts without alteration, was central to Mesopotamian scribal practice. Scribes were trained not to innovate, but to preserve. A good scribe was one who copied accurately, who maintained orthographic consistency, who reproduced the source text exactly as it appeared. Creativity was not valued in scribal education, fidelity was. The goal was to ensure that knowledge, once recorded, was not lost. The archive was the institution's memory, and the scribes were its custodians. This institutional memory extended across generations. A tablet inscribed in the early dynastic period, around 2500 BCE, might be copied in the Ur-III period, around 2100 BCE, then copied again in the Old Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE. Each copy referenced earlier sources. Each scribe noted when the original was damaged, unclear, or incomplete. But the content was not revised. The numbers were not updated. The language was not modernized. The text remained as it was, even when the world it described no longer existed. The Sumerian King List is an example of this process. The antediluvian kings, Alulim, Al-Aljar, Enmen-Luana, are recorded in the Ur-III manuscripts with the same reign lengths that appear in all other versions. These figures were not calculated during the Ur-III period. They were inherited from earlier sources. The scribes copied them because earlier scribes had copied them. The chain of transmission stretched back through centuries, perhaps millennia, to an origin point that is no longer accessible. What this means is that the King List was not created by any single scribe or institution. It was compiled, over time, from multiple earlier sources. The colophons sometimes reference old tablets or brick inscriptions, physical objects that contained portions of the King List in fragmentary form. The scribes who compiled the full list during the Ur-III period were synthesizing these fragments, organizing them into a coherent sequence, and producing a unified version that could be copied and distributed. But they were not inventing content, they were organizing inheritance. This act of organization was not neutral. The scribes made choices about which sources to include, how to order dynasties, and where to place the flood. Different versions of the King List reflect different organizational choices. Some versions include rulers not found in others. Some place the flood at different points in the sequence. Some list alternate reign lengths for the same king. These variations are not errors. They are evidence of different source traditions, different archives, different institutional priorities. The scribes were compiling from what they had, and what they had was not uniform. But despite these variations, the core structure remains stable. The antediluvian kings are always listed before the flood. The post-diluvian kings are always listed after. The dynasties proceed in roughly the same order: Kish, Uruk, Ur. The reign lengths, while they vary slightly between manuscripts, follow the same general pattern. Very long before the flood, moderately long after, gradually shorter as the list approaches the scribe's own present. The consistency suggests that the tradition was already ancient when the earliest surviving manuscripts were written. The scribes were preserving something older than themselves, older than their institutions, older than their cities. What they were preserving was a claim that kingship had a history, that it had moved through time and space, that it had been held by named individuals in named cities, and that this history could be documented. Whether the history was accurate, whether the numbers were literal, whether the names corresponded to real individuals, these questions were less important than the fact that the history existed and had been preserved. The King List was not a chronology. It was an archive of archives, a record that earlier records had existed and that they had said these things. This is why the King List resists editorial synthesis. The scribes did not harmonize contradictions. They did not resolve ambiguities. They did not create a single authoritative version. They copied what they found, preserved the variations, and noted where sources diverged. The tradition was plural because the archives were plural. Each city maintained its own records. Each dynasty claimed its own legitimacy. The King List compiled these claims without adjudicating between them. It presented them all, side by side, as part of a larger tradition of remembering. This method of compilation, additive rather than synthetic, is characteristic of Mesopotamian historiography. The scribes did not write history in the modern sense. They did not construct narratives, analyze causes, or interpret events. They compiled records. They listed what had been recorded in the order it had been recorded and preserved it for future reference. The King List is a product of this method. It is not a story, it is a catalogue of rulers, of cities, of reign lengths, a catalogue of what earlier scribes had written, copied forward so that it would not be lost. The question this raises is, what did the original sources look like? If the Ur-3 scribes were copying from old tablets, how old were those tablets? If the tablets referenced brick inscriptions, where were those bricks? If the sources included oral traditions, when were they first written down? The texts do not answer these questions. The earliest surviving manuscripts are already copies. The originals are gone. What remains is the tradition of copying, scribes preserving what scribes before them preserved, in an unbroken chain that stretches back to a beginning that cannot be located. This is the nature of archives built after the fact. The King List was not written as events occurred. It was written afterward, compiled from earlier materials, organized into a sequence, and preserved because preservation was the scribe's responsibility. The institution of kingship had passed through cities. The institution of record-keeping had preserved the names. The scribes compiled both, kingship and record-keeping, into a single document that claimed continuity from the moment kingship first descended to the moment the scribe set down his stylus. The archive was the proof, the copy was the evidence, and the numbers, however implausible, were part of what was remembered. The Sumerian King List is not the only ancient text to record extraordinarily long reigns or lifespans. The Manetho King List, preserved by later Greek and Roman historians, attributes multi-century reigns to Egyptian pharaohs of the First Dynasty. The Book of Genesis records patriarchs living for centuries: Methuselah for 969 years, Noah for 950. The Puranas, sacred Hindu texts, describe kings of ancient India ruling for thousands of years. The ancient Chinese tradition preserves accounts of early emperors whose reigns extended far beyond normal human lifespans. These traditions are geographically dispersed, linguistically unrelated, and culturally distinct. They do not share a common origin, yet they share a common structure. They describe early rulers before recorded history stabilizes as living or ruling far longer than later rulers. This structural similarity does not imply contact. It does not suggest diffusion of ideas across cultures. It suggests that different societies confronting the same problem, how to account for the deep past, arrived at similar solutions. The problem is chronological. Cities, institutions, and collective memory extend back further than individual human lifespans. How does a society explain its own antiquity? How does it account for the time between the founding of the first cities and the emergence of written records? One solution is to extend the reigns of early rulers, compressing centuries of institutional history into the lifespans of a few named individuals. The numbers become placeholders for periods that are remembered collectively but not individually. This does not mean the numbers are meaningless. It means they measure something other than individual lifespans. They measure institutional continuity, dynastic duration, or collective memory. A king who ruled for 1,200 years might represent a dynasty that lasted 12 generations, each generation lasting 100 years. A king who ruled for 28,800 years might represent an era that lasted 800 generations, each generation lasting 36 years. The numbers preserve structure, even if the structure is no longer understood by the scribes who copied them. The Sumerian King List does not explain its relationship to these other traditions. It cannot, because it predates most of them. The earliest manuscripts of the King List are contemporary with the early dynastic period in Egypt, before Manetho's sources were compiled. The Puranas were composed millennia later. The Genesis genealogies were recorded in the first millennium BCE, long after the Sumerian sources. There is no evidence of textual borrowing, but the structural similarity suggests a common cognitive strategy. When faced with a past that extends beyond memory, early historians compress time into extended lifespans. What is distinct about the Sumerian King List is its precision. The Genesis genealogies list patriarchs and ages, but they do not attempt to document every ruler in every city. They focus on a single lineage. The Puranas describe eras and cosmic cycles, but they do not provide continuous political history. The Sumerian King List does both. It lists individual rulers, assigns them to cities, records their reign lengths, and attempts to account for the entire span from the first descent of kingship to the scribe's own present. It is not a genealogy. It is not a cosmology. It is a political chronology, maintained across centuries, preserved because it documented the transfer of legitimate authority. This distinction matters because it reveals the purpose of the text. The King List was not theological, it was not explanatory, it was not narrative, it was legal. It was a record of who held kingship, in what order, and for how long. This information was institutionally important because it established precedent. If a city claimed kingship, it needed to demonstrate that kingship had been held there before. The King List provided that demonstration. It was evidence of continuity, of legitimacy, of rightful possession of the office. The numbers were less important than the sequence. The sequence proved the claim. This is why the list was copied so carefully. The scribes were not preserving a story, they were preserving a legal document. To alter the list would have been to alter the record of legitimacy. A city whose dynasty was omitted from the list would lose its claim to have ever held kingship. A city whose dynasty was placed out of sequence would lose its claim to precedence. The list was politically consequential. It shaped how cities understood their place in history and how they justified their authority in the present. But if the list was politically consequential, it was also politically contested. The variations between manuscripts reflect different political perspectives. Some versions emphasize Kish, others emphasize Uruk. Some place early in the sequence, others place it later. These are not accidental differences, they are reflections of the city's own claims to priority. The scribes who compiled the list were not neutral historians. They were representatives of institutions that had stakes in how history was recorded. The list they produced reflected those stakes. Yet despite these variations, the structure persists. The antediluvian kings are always long-lived. The flood is always a dividing event. Kingship always descends, moves, and continues. The core tradition is stable, even when the details are contested. This stability suggests that the tradition was older than any single city's claim, older than any individual scribe's agenda, older than the political conflicts that shaped the different versions. The tradition was inherited. The scribes could adjust it, emphasize certain parts, and omit others, but they could not rewrite it entirely. The inheritance constrained what they could say. What this reveals is that the Sumerian King List, like the other long-reign traditions, was not a historical reconstruction, it was a preservation. The scribes were not trying to determine what actually happened, they were trying to preserve what had been said. The earlier records, oral or written, claimed that kingship had existed for tens of thousands of years, that it had been held by rulers with certain names, and that it had moved between certain cities. The later scribes copied these claims because the claims were part of the tradition, and the tradition was authoritative. Whether the claims were accurate was less important than whether they were preserved. This does not mean the scribes believed the numbers were literal. It means they believed the tradition was worth preserving, even if the numbers no longer made sense. The tradition carried authority because it was old, because it had been transmitted across generations, because it was part of the institutional memory that defined what kingship was. To discard the tradition would have been to discard the foundation on which current kingship rested. The list was not history. It was legitimacy in documentary form, and legitimacy, once granted, cannot be edited without consequence. What the echoes beyond the rivers suggest is that this problem, how to account for antiquity, was universal. Different cultures solved it differently, but they all solved it by extending time. They gave their ancestors longer lives, longer reigns, or longer eras. They compressed institutional continuity into individual names. They preserved numbers that did not correspond to observable reality, because the numbers preserved memory, and memory, in the ancient world, was the foundation of authority. The Sumerian King List is one solution to this problem. It is not unique, but it is precise, systematic, and remarkably well preserved. It is what remains when a civilization tries to remember everything it was, even when the numbers no longer add up. The Ur-3 state, which produced many of the surviving copies of the Sumerian King List, collapsed around 2004 BCE. The collapse was sudden. Administrative tablets from the final year of the last king, Ibi-Sin, record desperate attempts to maintain order, ration distributions failing, defensive walls being built, correspondence with cities that had ceased to respond. Then the tablets stop. Not burned, not smashed, simply unfiled. The last scribes set down their reeds and never returned. The archives remained intact, buried in mud-brick chambers, preserved by the dry climate of southern Mesopotamia. When excavators uncovered them 3,000 years later, the tablets were still legible. The administration had ended, the records had not. This pattern, collapse without erasure, is characteristic of Mesopotamian civilization. Cities fell, dynasties ended, empires disintegrated. But the archives survived. The tablets were not destroyed during conquest. They were often left in place, sometimes reburied, sometimes reused as building fill, but rarely burned or intentionally obliterated. The conquerors did not erase the records. They sometimes copied them. The tradition of record-keeping outlasted the institutions that created the records. This is why the Sumerian King List survived. It was not destroyed when the Sumerian language ceased to be spoken. It was copied by Akkadian-speaking scribes, who preserved it even though they no longer lived in a Sumerian-ruled state. It was copied during the Old Babylonian period, when political power had shifted to Babylon. It was copied during the Kassite period, when foreign dynasties ruled Mesopotamia. It was copied during the Neo-Assyrian period, when Assyria dominated the region. It was copied during the Neo-Babylonian period, when Babylon was briefly resurgent. Each generation of scribes preserved the list, even though the kingship it described was no longer the kingship they served. Why did they preserve it? One reason is institutional inertia. Scribes copied what earlier scribes had copied. The tradition of copying was itself a tradition worth maintaining. To stop copying the king list would have been to break the chain of transmission, and the chain was valuable in itself. The archive was not just a collection of information, it was proof that the institution had continuity, that it had existed before and would exist afterward, that it could outlast any individual ruler or dynasty. Another reason is that the king list provided legitimacy. Later kings, even those who ruled centuries after the list was compiled, continued to claim descent from the rulers it recorded. Hammurabi of Babylon, ruling around 1750 BCE, claimed descent from the kings of Uruk. The Neo-Assyrian kings claimed descent from Sargon of Akkad, who appears in later versions of the king list. The list was not just history, it was genealogy. It established chains of authority that later rulers could claim as their own. A third reason is that the list documented something no longer visible in the present. The cities it described, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, were ruins by the time the later copies were made. Kingship had moved to other cities, other regions. The Sumerian language was dead, the dynasties were extinct, but the memory persisted. The list was evidence that something older had existed, that the present order was not the beginning, that there had been cities and kings before. The list was a reminder of depth, of layers, of a past that extended beyond living memory. What is striking is what did not collapse. The cities fell, but the sites remained occupied. The dynasties ended, but new dynasties emerged. The Sumerian language ceased to be spoken, but Sumerian texts continued to be copied. The institutions changed, but the tradition of institutional memory persisted. This is collapse without erasure. The physical structures decayed, the administrative systems dissolved, but the records survived, and with them the claim to continuity. This is why the Sumerian King List was never revised to reflect political realities. It was never updated to include the kings of Babylon, the kings of Assyria, or the Persian and Greek rulers who later controlled Mesopotamia. The list ends, depending on the manuscript, sometime in the early 2nd millennium BCE. After that point, it was no longer extended. It was simply copied over and over as a record of what had been, not what was. It became a historical document, preserved not because it was current, but because it was old. This transformation, from administrative tool to historical artifact, occurred gradually. The earliest copies were functional. They documented the transfer of kingship for political purposes. The later copies were educational. They were used to teach scribes the Sumerian language, to familiarize them with the names of ancient cities, to instruct them in the tradition of record-keeping. The content remained the same, but the purpose shifted. The list was no longer a working document. It was a monument to the past, copied because the past was worth remembering. What this reveals is that Mesopotamian civilization did not collapse in the sense of disappearing. It collapsed in the sense of changing. The institutions that created the Sumerian King List ended, but the list itself persisted. The scribes who preserved it were not Sumerians. They were Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians. They served different kings, spoke different languages, and lived in different political realities. But they continued to copy the list, because the tradition of copying was itself a form of continuity. The archive outlasted the city. The text outlasted the language. The memory outlasted the rulers it commemorated. This is the paradox of collapse without erasure. The civilization ended, but its records did not. The kingship described in the list moved on, fragmented, and eventually disappeared. But the list remained, filed in archives, buried in ruins, preserved by scribes who no longer ruled cities, but still maintained libraries. When excavators uncovered these tablets in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found not scattered fragments, but organized collections. Archives that had been carefully maintained, sealed, and left for future discovery. The collapse was political, the preservation was institutional, the memory survived. The Sumerian King List does not claim that kingship was invented, it claims that kingship descended. It does not explain why the reigns are so long, it records them without apology. It does not harmonize contradictions between manuscripts, it preserves them. It does not interpret the flood, it marks it as a boundary. It does not describe the gods ruling, it assigns rule to humans. It does not justify its numbers, it simply lists them. The text is precise in what it records and silent about what it means. This silence is the most significant feature of the King List. In a textual tradition that includes myths, hymns, prayers, and wisdom literature, all of which explain, interpret, and justify, the King List stands apart. It does not explain, it documents. It is not a story about kingship, it is a record of kingship. The scribes who compiled it were not constructing a narrative, they were compiling an archive. The list is what survives when memory is preserved without interpretation, when names and numbers are recorded because they were inherited, and when the act of copying is treated as sufficient justification for preservation. What the list does not claim is as revealing as what it does. It does not claim the antediluvian kings were gods. It does not claim they were immortal. It does not claim they built the cities they ruled. Those cities are simply there, already in existence when kingship descends. It does not claim the post-diluvian kings remembered the antediluvian period. There is no survivor narrative, no ark carrying records, no explanation of how the tradition was transmitted across the flood. It does not claim the scribes understood the numbers. There is no colophon explaining the system, no editorial note questioning the figures, no attempt to reconcile the reign lengths with human biology. The text records. It does not justify. This refusal to explain suggests that the scribes did not see explanation as their role. Their role was preservation. They copied what earlier scribes had written. They organized it into sequences. They noted where sources diverged, but they did not interpret. Interpretation would have required them to impose their own understanding onto the tradition, and the tradition was older than their understanding. The list was inherited. The inheritance was authoritative. To question it would have been to break the chain. What this leaves is a text that resists closure. Every attempt to interpret the Sumerian King List, to explain what the numbers mean, to identify what the kings were, to determine whether the tradition is historical or symbolic, runs into the text's silence. The text does not answer these questions, it does not ask them, it simply lists names, cities, reign lengths. The sequence is clear, the meaning is not. This ambiguity is structural, not accidental. The King List is a compilation of sources that were already old when they were compiled. The sources came from different cities, different archives, different periods. They did not agree on every detail. The scribes preserved the disagreements. They copied multiple versions. They noted variations. But they did not resolve them. The tradition was plural, and the plurality was preserved. What this suggests is that the Sumerian King List was never intended to be a single authoritative account. It was a collection of claims, each with its own legitimacy, each preserved because it had been inherited. The list does not say which city held kingship first. It says that Eridu received it first, but other texts claim Kish received it first, and still others emphasize Uruk. The list does not say which kings were real. It lists them all, without distinguishing between those who are archaeologically attested and those who exist only in the textual tradition. The list does not say how long the kings ruled in solar years, or lunar years, or generational cycles. It records numbers in the sexagesimal system and leaves the interpretation to the reader. But the readers, later scribes, modern scholars, anyone confronting the text, are not given the tools to interpret. The key is missing. The system that produced the numbers is not explained. The sources that provided the names are not identified. The tradition that justified the preservation is not articulated. The list is complete as a list, but incomplete as an explanation. It is a record that documents its own existence without revealing how it came to exist. This incompleteness is the text's defining feature. It is why the Sumerian King List continues to generate questions rather than answers. It is why every interpretation, mythological, historical, astronomical, symbolic, can claim some support from the text, but cannot claim definitive support. The text accommodates interpretation, but does not require it. It functions as a record, whether or not anyone understands what it records. What the list does claim is continuity. Kingship descended, it was held, it moved, it continued. The sequence is unbroken, even when the cities fall, even when the dynasties end, even when the flood sweeps over. The institution persists. The names are remembered. The numbers are preserved. This continuity is the point. The list asserts that kingship had a history, that the history was documented, and that the documentation was worth preserving, even when the details no longer made sense. This assertion, that kingship is old, that it was held by named rulers, that it moved through time and space according to a sequence that can be listed, is the King List's only claim. It does not claim the sequence is comprehensible. It does not claim the numbers are believable. It does not claim the kings were gods or humans or something in between. It claims only that the tradition exists, that it was inherited, and that it has been copied forward. The list is its own evidence. The preservation is its own justification, and the silence is its own answer. What remains, then, is the question the list does not ask. Why preserve this? Why copy numbers that do not correspond to human lifespans? Why list kings whose cities have no palaces? Why maintain a tradition that no longer functions as political justification? The scribes do not answer. They simply continue copying. The tablets accumulate, the tradition persists, and the question remains open, filed alongside the records, waiting.